Wake up your morning in a brand new way with the positive people, places, events, and things in and around your neighborhood and around the world. No matter where you live, your mornings are about to get better. It's the refreshing way to start your day. No doom or gloom, just bright sunshine no matter what the weather. Metro Magazine with Bonnie McDaniel. Inspiring, informative, intelligent, Ion. Positively the best way to start your morning. Good morning and welcome to Metro Magazine. I am so excited this morning because we're going to mix things up a little bit today. As you know, we've been filming our Amazing Women series, and today we've actually invited a man into the room. He's going to talk about economic stress and the impact that it has had on everyone, but also on women. So before we go any further with introducing him, I'm going to allow him to introduce himself and Robert Brown, who is the author of this amazing new book called Economic Stress. Robert, welcome to Metro Magazine.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I will have to tell you, when I started reading the book, it was wow. Although you know a lot of the things that are going on with a lot of people around you, you don't really understand the impact that it has had on a very personal level. Yes. And you have done a wonderful, wonderful job of illustrating the impact that the economy has had on people, on their lives, on families. But more importantly, you also have kind of mapped out a path for people to be able to take some possibilities that they might be able to turn the tide and what's happening in our country and basically in our world, because we're no longer in a contained to just here. We really are a global economy. What happens abroad very much affects us. So before we even get into the book, I want to establish a foundation so people know who Robert Brown
Sure.
is. So you grew up here in Alexandria.
It's interesting, and thank you for the acknowledgement for the book. It's interesting because I grew up literally 2 minutes from here.
Okay.
And I'm a native Washingtonian. I have lived in the Washington, D.C. metro area all of my life. Went to school and was always very interested in people and helping to empower people. And so when I was in college, I majored in sociology.
Now, I'm going to stop you there for a second because, not to put you on the spot, but this word of empower
Yes.
Has become kind of the buzzword of the 21st century. And you said you were always interested in empowerment. So at the time when you were growing up here, what did that look like? What did it feel like? Talk about.
Well, I wasn't sure what it looked like at that point. And I think what really helped to spur my interest in ways to help empower people was my first job, believe it or not, was as a stock boy at the World Bank.
Okay.
And so that was a 17-year-old kid getting exposure to people from all over the world. And so that really fostered my interest in, wow, I never thought people looked this way or sounded this way or did these things from a cultural perspective. And as I became older, my interest in some of the issues from a global perspective really began to grow and take shape, if you will. And
now, I'm curious, a stock boy at the World Bank, I'm very, my imagination kind of runs wild with me. So when you say a stock boy at the World Bank, I'm trying to figure out what do you stock in the World Bank? Are you talking actual money?
Well, I wish it was money, but what happened was I was a stock boy, and one of the primary documents that the World Bank produced was what was called the World Development Report.
Okay.
And so I was stocking those documents. I mean, they would send out literally tens of thousands around the world in different languages, as you might imagine. But one day it just so happened that I was typing. And when I was in high school, I had the fastest time writing in my entire class of girls. And so one person heard this click and click and click and said, "Who is that?" I said, "Well, that's Robert." And so that caused me to move up. I became a typist, and I became like a word processor. In those days, we had word processing machines. And so that was sort of the sort of movement until the point where I became a professional at the World Bank. But what was also happening was I really became interested in these issues around health and healing.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt you at different points
Sure.
because I see a young man who is moving up at an international concern, and you said you were typing.
Yes.
And at that time, especially, that was pretty much a pool where women kind of played.
It was, and that
what did that do to you in terms of understanding women, or talk about that for a minute?
It certainly made me think in terms of how secure I was as a young man being in a women-only environment.
Did you feel that you had an advantage over them because you were a man, or what was that dynamic? It was just the opposite
for me. I felt like I had something to prove.
Okay.
Because
oh, so you were playing in their pond, so you were
very much so. Okay. And so for me, it was, you know what, I've got just as much skill as you do on this typewriter, and I'm going to show you. And so you'd have these time writings, and the typing instructor would always say, well, who got the best time writing, fastest, with the fewest mistakes?
Okay.
And so after a while, that began to be me consistently. So that to me was, hey, I'm in. So
interesting.
That was a good period for me. But as I began to get older, what was becoming more of a concern to me was these issues in health. And obviously, when you're looking at health disparities in the developing world, we're talking about severe gaps in health and healthcare access.
And so you got that because of your being exposed
to the bank, but then also looking at some of the health issues here in America. And certainly when you're talking about poor people or people who are coming from underserved communities, there tend to be disproportionately higher levels of health disparity. And so when I went back to grad school...
So your undergraduate work was in sociology.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I went on to get a master's degree in sociology as well, but with an emphasis in demography, which is really where you're focusing on the populations. And so in looking at these populations, again, the issues around health, healing, and illness began to emerge for me. So I'm thinking, you know what, I really have this interest in health and understanding what are some of the reasons why there are better health outcomes for some groups of people versus others. When I went to school for the third time to work on a PhD, I focused on medical sociology. And so now I get to not only look at these issues from a behavioral, cultural, and social context, but I'm also looking at the issues in health, healing, and illness. So it's sort of a merging of the two.
Okay.
And so as a medical sociologist, I'm not just concerned with the health outcome that a person might be experiencing, but I'm also concerned about what are some of the behavioral, cultural, and social factors that contribute to it. So as a result of that, I'm now able to look at these health indicators as a reason why certain people have healthier outcomes versus others.
Okay.
And so the health outcome is really symptomatic of something else.
Okay.
It really goes to perhaps things like lack of access to proper health care, perhaps lack of access to environments that are clean. We talk about the extent to which some of the worst air you can breathe is on an airplane. But you've got some people who are living in environments that are toxic all the time, especially those who may be in poor neighborhoods where there may be factories that are bellowing, you know, the smoke and the fumes all the time. So it's that kind of thing.
I'm curious, because of your educational background in this field, what has been your messaging? Because I would say over the last 10 years especially, this whole conversation, or it probably, I would say it began even before then, but more so in recent years, this whole discussion about healthcare and the problems that a lot of people are having in different classes. Has there been any messaging that has come out from you on this topic?
Sure. Health is a state of mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, and economic well-being.
Okay.
And so I've always looked at health as a holistic process. It isn't just the absence of an illness or a disease. And so to the extent that we can, we've got to send that message across communities, across race and ethnicity. We've got to spread that message across geographic location, because if your health is affected in an adverse way, then it's going to change other parts of your life, and so it's going to affect the quality of your living. And so you think about the extent to which little children, you know, who are going hungry first thing in the morning, are going to be at a disadvantage in terms of their ability to retain information, to be receptive to learning, because their bellies have not been filled. So when you think about some of the programs that have been affected in the last few years as it relates to people who are perhaps underserved or poor, you know, those all have an impact on health outcomes. And
now you're talking about, because at a point, you know, a few minutes from now, we're going to really parlay this discussion into your book. You're talking about healthcare. You're talking about quality of health.
Yeah.
And the question I want to ask you is to talk a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the economic implications when it comes to healthcare?
Well, when you talk about the economic implications of healthcare, the people with the most money have access to the best healthcare. We know this. When you look at people who are poor and or perhaps come from underserved communities, in too many instances, they are using the emergency room as the primary healthcare vehicle. That's the worst case scenario because if a person who is poor, who doesn't have health insurance, who may not even be on Medicaid, has to use the emergency room as a primary healthcare vehicle, usually that tends to mean that the person has a health issue that is at a point where we've moved not from the primary level of care, which is where you stop something before it starts, or the secondary level of care, which you're trying to manage a health issue, but they're in the tertiary level where you're trying to make that person as comfortable as they can be because the health issue has gotten to a point now where the medical community is no longer in a position to reduce or eliminate that health challenge.
Okay, so talk then specifically about I don't know if you've done any research, I'm sure you have, on the difference between preventative medicine as opposed to where you're actually treating a disease.
Well, prevention could in fact be treating a disease in some instances, but when we talk about prevention, we're talking about regular checkups.
Yes.
We're talking not just about going to the doctor, but we're also talking about the health protective behaviors that an individual,
and that's what I want to focus
engages in him or herself.
Okay.
So it may be drinking enough water, it may be getting enough exercise, it may be really monitoring the intake of things like too much sugar, too much salt. It might be having that quiet time with yourself so that you really are in tune with what it is you're feeling and why it is you're feeling that way. It's also your ability to manage stress effectively. Stress is a fact of life. We can't get away from it, but we can learn how to manage it more effectively. So in addition to going to a healthcare provider on a regular basis, it also has to do with your own personal health belief system as it relates to a healthier lifestyle, a healthier outlook on life, even though the challenges do come, but understanding that you believe that you have the ability inherently to have a healthy life.
Okay, we're going to stop just for a moment
Sure.
and take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about the book that he's written, Economic Stress, and how it has impacted a lot of the work that he's doing. So if you will just bear with us for just a moment, we'll be right back with more Metro Magazine.
Up to 40% of businesses never recover after experiencing a major disaster. Make a plan at ready.gov/business.
And we're back with more Metro Magazine. If you're just joining us, we are talking to Robert Brown, Dr. Rob, as he's called by many of his followers. He is the author of a compelling new book called Economic Stress. And Dr. Rob, when we went to break, you were talking about healthcare and the impact it's having on our communities. In particular, you were talking about stress, and that's going to give us a nice segue into talking about your book. So if you wanted to continue.
Yes, I was saying in the previous segment that stress is a fact of life. We can't get away from it, but we can learn to manage it more effectively. And what I always recommend is for a person to try to understand what is the cause of the stress. But if you are constantly in a situation or circumstances where stress is really elevated to a point where it's become chronic, then that can be a point at which your body loses its ability to fight off the impact of the stress. And so you may be more prone to headaches, colds, stomach disruptions, and it can even escalate to the point where it could be the onset or the facilitator of things like cancer, kidney disease, and even death. And so while stress can help us to do the things we need to do, it can also be an enemy to us.
So it's basically learning how to manage it.
It's learning how to manage it, and it's also understanding how you perceive things, because what's stressful for you may not be stressful for me, and vice versa. And so once you learn what those triggers are, then you can learn and understand what kind of strategies you can bring to bear to manage it more effectively.
Okay. Now, we're going to talk about this book because when I first started reading it, it was interesting the way I felt when starting to read it, because you profile a number of people who are in very, very stressful situations. But I also, again, like the fact that you went from talking about the negative, and you also laid out some things that people can do in order to change their situation. So why don't we talk about, first of all, what is economic stress?
Well, before I give you a definition of what I think economic stress is, what I wanted to do for this book was really personalize it.
Okay.
And economic stress is not the most exciting topic, but what I thought might be useful is to validate how economic stress is making people feel. And so I define economic stress as the inability of a person or family to meet their financial obligations because of job loss, not enough work, job instability or low wages, and the impact on their mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, and economic well-being. And you notice the back half of that definition encompasses my definition of health. And so in creating that type of definition, I wanted people to understand that it isn't just about the financial component, which is readily obvious, but it's also about how it can make you feel as a human being.
And I think, you bring up an interesting point, because if you turn on the television or listen to the news on any given day, there are a number of people who are responding to economic stress.
Yes.
And a lot of times is in a very negative way. There have been a number of people who've committed suicide, who've not just taken their own lives, but their families' lives, people who go on shooting rampages. Would you say this is all a result of this topic?
In some instances, it could be. And as I said earlier, stress is very dynamic and it can affect each person in a different way, but surely over time, each of us has a store of vitality, if you will, that allows us to fight off the negative effects of the stress. But over time, that store begins to erode. And so when you get to the point where the erosion has taken place, that's when negative things can occur. And so when you look at some of the levels of violence that we're seeing now, where we're having more people who are seemingly going into places, businesses. We just had a shooting last week where a person went in and killed 2 people before taking his own life. There are more instances of this, and certainly you could attribute some of those occurrences to the levels of economic stress that are being felt by so many people around the country.
Now, if you look at it from a historical standpoint, I would say if you look at periods, especially in our history, the Great Depression, you look at a number of wars that we've had, and the changes. I remember even if you think about the 70s, we were in a terrible crisis. I was in college at that time, and I don't seem to recall people responding the way then to the way we are now. Why do you think we're handling it differently?
I think there are a few things. The first thing is there's no playbook for what we're seeing. What has happened over the last several years?
Well, would you say there was a playbook for World War II or for the Great Depression? Was there a playbook for that?
No, but I think that what has happened is, one of the things that has happened in this 21st century is the work demands have gone up significantly. The other piece of that is oftentimes you have work environments that have become more toxic because more and more work demands are being placed on people that are asked to do more because their colleagues have been laid off right in front of them.
But I want to still go back to the point that, yes, the economic stresses that we're having are different than, say 50 years ago. The fact of the matter is that there were still economic stresses. Is there anything, do you think, within our society, the dynamics of, the change of families?
Well, if you look at...
Has that impact? Because whatever is going on in the home normally will carry out to, relationships with other people. So what impact, is the question I'm asking you, has that had on how people are able to manage their stress?
Well, if you look at the structure of the economy from an historic perspective, we have, at the beginning of the 20th century, we were still in an agrarian economy, quickly migrating into an industrial economy. We've gone from an industrial-based economy with the World Wars I and II, and after World War II, we moved into a services and information-based economy, which is where we are now. The other piece about the first half of the 20th century was the dollar went a lot further in those days. The other piece of that was the rate of inflation was still at a point where people were able to keep up. But the rate of inflation in the 21st century has gotten to a point where people are not able to get as far with the dollars that they make as they used to, and we look back in history. The other thing that the components of the family have changed. Now we no longer live in an environment where we have, the Ozzie and Harriet scenario, the father knows best scenarios as much as we used to in those days. But what has happened is the family has evolved and changed as well. It's interesting because if you look at what used to be considered a nuclear family, it was mother, father, 2 children. But now a nuclear family includes single parent family households. And so that has changed, but I also think some of the dynamics within the family in terms of some of those basic values that used to be fairly prevalent among more families in terms of hard work, discipline, respect. There was a more collaborative approach and intermingling of family members versus now, because of this technological revolution we're in, people will come to the dinner table and each person in that family is looking at their gizmo, whether it's a smartphone, whether they're listening to music, but no one's talking to one another, no one's asking how is your day, how are you feeling. And all of these things sometimes can contribute to levels of isolation that go unnoticed.
You bring up an interesting point, because I remember when I was a very, very little girl, and one of my family members, a cousin, lost a job and he had a family. And what was interesting about the way the family handled that and the way I see people handle things now tells me a lot about possibly why people are feeling the stresses that they do. And it really does come under the umbrella of support. I remember my grandfather calling all the men in the family who were employed, and I lived with my grandmother. They came to my grandmother's house. And although I wasn't in the room, I could hear what was going on in the room. And basically the discussion was, we have a situation. So-and-so and so is without work, and those babies have to be taken care of. What are we going to do? The men rallied around. The women also knew that, if there were clothing, additional clothing that was needed, or food that needed to be prepared, an extra, pot of stew or whatever needed to happen. The attitude was different. So although I was a little girl, when I look back on that, I think in my mind that my cousin perhaps felt like he could focus on finding work and not focus on, what's going to happen because he knew he had the support of the family. My question to you is, how has that changed in your research? Is there a lot of that anymore?
It still exists, but I think it's more diffuse than in previous generations. What you're finding is that, unfortunately, you may have people in a household, different generations, maybe 2 or 3 generations in the same household, believe it or not, competing for the same job. And an example is a young woman that I spoke with who was a recent college graduate. She was living with a roommate near the university. She wasn't able to afford her portion of the rent because she couldn't find work. She ended up moving back home with her family. 6 months prior to her moving back, her father had been laid off. Her mother had always been a stay-at-home mom, so she moves back in with her parents. After about 2 or 3 months of looking for work at home, she did in fact find a job. And so she comes home, she tells the parents, she's really excited. And as she is describing the position, the parents ask her to talk a little bit about the company. And as she talks about the company, the mood in the room changes, because what she doesn't realize is her father had applied for that same position.
Oh, wow.
And so we've got more and more instances of that. And so obviously the daughter has become the head of the household, you see. So it's that kind of thing that's happening, but also in the work environment, Bonnie, what has changed is that more and more employees are feeling put upon because they don't feel valued. And so some of the energy that you get sometimes from employers is, you should be thankful to even have this job.
Why do you think that has changed with employers in terms of their relationships with their workforce. What do you think has caused that?
I think it's because of the levels of job scarcity that we are now facing. I think it's because the private sector has become accustomed to having fewer workers because of outsourcing. The president just a couple of days ago in the State of the Union address talked about doing more insourcing, which would clearly be a good thing. But the other piece of it is some employers, not all, but some are saying there are 125 people waiting for your job.
But you know what? And I hear what you're saying. There are a lot of people out there looking for work, so he gets the pick, of the crop. But isn't there a certain amount of responsibility that really does rest on the shoulders of people who are in positions to hire to maybe think differently about their workforce? I mean, talk about that, because...
Well, and this is the irony, there are many jobs that are going unfilled because we have a labor force in part that does not have the skill sets to meet the demands of those
And that was
positions.
something else I think I heard in the address.
Yeah, that came out as well. But the question I have is, how then do we give access to American workers so that they can acquire those skills so that they can get those positions? Because as you said at the top of the show, we now live in a global economy. This is a global labor market. And so what are some of the things that we can do to help ensure that Americans are getting access to the skill sets that they can get these positions of the 21st century? It is one of the greatest tragedies when I encounter students at the end of a program of study and they're about to graduate, and I ask them and say, well, what are your plans now? And what they say is, well, I guess I need to go out and start to look for a job. That's very, very distressing to me because in my mind, that process should have begun the first semester of their freshman year. And so what is happening more of the time now is you've got people who have the skill sets, but they're not able to deploy those skills in a position because they don't have the access.
Now, you bring up two interesting points that I want to touch upon. One is the idea of there being many positions and not enough skilled workers to fill those positions. And I seem to recall, again, during the address, that there was a company, I think that was in North Carolina, that was profiled, who took it upon themselves to say, you know what, this is the situation we have, and this is the solution in order to turn that situation around. And they became involved in making sure that they had skilled workers by making the investment in people. And I can remember at least there being conversation and looking at some historical accounts where companies used to do that.
Well, if recall now, right after World War II, the federal government invented the middle class in this country. It was a federal government experiment that was wildly successful, and it was because of the infusion of resources at the federal level that were being used to help ensure that people could in fact get at least a shot at the American dream.
Are you saying that it's the federal government's responsibility to train workers, or is that something that we should really leave to industry to do that?
I think it's all of the above. I think in part it is on the shoulders of the federal government, and I also think it's a part of the industry's responsibility to help ensure.
Can we handle that though?
Well, in this day and age, with all of the divisiveness,
no, forget about the divisiveness. I mean, if you look at the deficit, look at how much money we're putting out and what we're not bringing in. Can we really afford to do that? And what I really want to lead this discussion to is not so much on an individual basis as much as on a partnering with company basis. Meaning that's where the federal government becomes involved. So,
well, if you look at the tens of millions of dollars and billions of dollars that is being spent on the war in Afghanistan, okay, if you look at the extent to which resources are being used every day for that engagement, and if you were to take a fraction of those dollars and infuse them in communities to engage stakeholders, people at the grassroots levels, people in the private sector, people who are philanthropically oriented.
Are you talking about people, or are you talking about organizations who can manage the process? And that's what I'm questioning, whether or not the federal government can.
I think that those organizations would have to be identified, and I think that there would have to be very, very discreet objectives that would be given to those organizations.
Okay.
But I think that there are organizations, you mentioned the company in North Carolina, that is clearly taking the lead on its own, not being encouraged or inspired to do it, but they say, you know, this is what we need to do for the people in the communities where we have our business.
And I take this conversation back to which in my mind seemed like a very simple scenario. I go back to, you know, my family having a crisis and how that crisis was addressed. And the effectiveness of not just my family, but I'm sure many, many other families who handle situations like that in the past. And the fact that they were invested and they managed because they were close to it. And I bring this forward to what you were just talking about in terms of the federal government and how they created the middle class. And whether or not today, if maybe the resolution for some of the problems we're having, whether or not it's best left in the hands of industries as opposed to individuals, because who's going to run that kind of thing from a government level?
I think it depends on who you ask, Bonnie. But just generally speaking, Bonnie, we are one big American family.
Right.
We are this mosaic. Okay. And I think if you go back to some of the statements that the president made, he was really extending the olive branch to each component of the American family.
Okay.
And if we were to look at this as, if I get something, it doesn't mean you lose anything.
Right.
But instead looking at it as, this is a potential for a win-win for everyone. I think if that sort of a mindset were used more now, as opposed to what you seem to be getting, a lot of rancor and divisiveness, that would help to, I think, create an energy where, you know what, if I give a little bit more, I can help some people who may not have even the basics that will help to empower them, and in turn they could help to empower me because of the skill sets that they could now bring to my company.
Okay.
And so it's identifying where the needs are, it's identifying where the skill sets are, it's identifying who has access to the resources, and trying to converge the three so that at the end of it, we have an America that is stronger, that is safer, that is more embracing of all of the people that make up the United States of America. And I think in so doing, what you're also doing is saying to the world that, you know what, we can get things done. We are facing some challenges, to be sure, but we have not lost the capacity to help one another because it is the right thing to do, not necessarily because we're going to get something out of it,
right, because
it helps to empower other people. And as you know about me, I'm all about empowerment.
Now, I'm going to digress just for a second, because there was another person that you profiled in the book, a female who... Patricia, who had worked, done all the right things, and she finds herself in a position where she's concerned about her job. She has actually been very responsible in terms of saving, putting money away in her 401k, and now she's having the questions in her mind of, what am I going to do? Do I take money out of that 401k? What's going to happen to me? Talk about her a little bit.
Patricia is a person who is very successful, very bright. She has been a go-getter all of her life. She has done all of the right things. She sacrificed, she went without, and as a result of that sort of a work ethic, she has become very successful. She,
on a financial level, because I looked at what she has in the bank, she's doing really well.
She's done really well. She's a single mother. She has a daughter who is in an Ivy League school. But for the very first time, the specter of unemployment has become a reality for her. And one of the people that she has in her life is a good friend, a man who was laid off, and it really exacted a toll on him and then also his family. As a matter of fact, it got to a point where he was experiencing depression and even had a brief thought about suicide. But fortunately, he was able to come back from the brink. He was able to keep his family intact, and as a result of his experiences, he's tried to really counsel Patricia on the idea of needing to change her mind about what success looks like. And I have a chapter in the book entitled The Necessity of Changing Your Mind. But the thing with Patricia, and this happens to a lot of people, she has never been unemployed. She's always had a job. She has become accustomed to a certain lifestyle. And because of that, the idea of potentially losing her job is completely unthinkable. And oh, by the way, she's in an industry that is in decline. Patricia's a baby boomer, which means that she was born between 1946 and 1964. She has not gotten to a place where she is willing to accept the possibility that she may in fact lose her job.
So what are people, because there are a lot of Patricias out there who
Yes.
find themselves, you know, they've worked all of their lives, they've squirreled away the money the way they were supposed to, they've raised the children, they're in college. What advice would you give someone who is, and I'll kind of relate this back to a recent occurrence. We just had a ice storm down in Atlanta, and I was talking to my daughter this morning about the fact that the thing that was most troubling about that situation that happened down south is the fact that they knew a storm was coming.
They knew it was coming.
People who are like Patricia, you can kind of, she seems like a very intelligent woman, you can kind of see the signs. Denial is a terrible, terrible thing to be in when you find yourself. Talk about that for a moment.
The denial is a symptom of pride and ego.
Okay.
And so she again has become accustomed to a certain lifestyle that she is unwilling to give up.
Okay. So is it the lifestyle, or is it, since I know that this is inevitable, what am I going to do to prepare myself in the meantime so that when that day happens, I am not without power? Because you're talking about empowering.
Yeah, well, the thing about Patricia is she is in a really blessed position because she has resources in her savings account, in her 401k, in her IRA. So she has investment vehicles that could help to tie her over if in fact a layoff were to occur. But for so many people, as you know, they're living from paycheck to paycheck. They may be making six figures, but they're still living paycheck to paycheck. Patricia is not one of those people.
But you know what, and I'm going back to the importance of health care, and of course with the Affordable Health Care Act just having passed and people now signing up for it, hopefully that's going to change what I'm about to say on a large scale. I remember when my dad, who was, for all intents and purposes, he was self-employed because he was a minister, and he was a saver. And he had a massive stroke, which means he had to pay for his own health care. All of that money that he had managed to save, in an instant, it was gone. I go back to the question I asked you previously. What does a person who knows a storm is coming, give some tips on as it has to do with healthcare, as it has to do with shifting, maybe going into another industry, preparing yourself, to pick up a different skill set. What are some of the things people can do when they see that storm is coming?
Well, the first thing you have to do is be willing to acknowledge it. That's the first thing, because a lot of people see it and they ignore it and act like, well, it's not going to affect me. And that's what Patricia is. Once you've acknowledged it, then you need to think as proactively as you can. The first thing that I would recommend doing is to alert your bill collectors that you feel that your job security may be in jeopardy. Especially if you have a mortgage, you have those fixed bills, and those items that are coming out of your account potentially on an automatic basis, like automatic withdrawals. So you first want to alert your bill collectors. In terms of the healthcare piece, and we've talked a lot about the Affordable Care Act, and it's certainly been in the news for the last several months, you want to make sure that you will have healthcare coverage after a layoff happens. Sometimes the health care will lapse the day that you are laid off. Sometimes you get to keep it for maybe a couple of weeks or a month.
And Cobra, that old Cobra plan was just crazy because it was so expensive.
Cobra is prohibitively expensive for a lot of people. And so if you have not signed up for the Affordable Care Act, which you have to do by March 31st, then now's the time. And so the more you can stay in front of these types of issues, the less you're in a position where you have to react. It's better to be able to respond to something than have to react to it.
What about career-wise? What would you say?
Well, career-wise, and if we're talking about people in their 40s and 50s, for example, sometimes they tend to be in career industries that are in decline. And so the process is finding out, how do you continue to make yourself relevant? One of the ways to do that, believe it or not, is having access and being engaged with social media. I'm talking about things like Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter.
LinkedIn I love because I can't tell you the number of times people have reached out to me
Right.
through LinkedIn. I've not done anything except my profile is up there.
Because what you want to do, you want to let the world know that you're there. And the other piece of this is if you have access to people who could advocate on your behalf, and I'm talking specifically about mentors and sponsors, it's always good to have a mentor and a sponsor. Now we know that a mentor is a person with whom you build a relationship, they help to coach your professional career and development. Some of the attributes of this relationship are trust, a willingness to be coachable, but the sponsor, Bonnie,
I love
is
the
even more
sponsorship.
important.
Yeah, they
because
are.
the sponsor is the person that gets you in the room. Part of the challenge now, and this isn't just for mid-career professionals, but entry-level workers, 20-year-olds. We are in this mechanized age now. And so when it comes to finding a job, the internet is not your friend. Because when you apply for a position, whether it's via a resume or an application, you hit the send button, you've just become a virtual piece of paper. Okay?
The internet is absolutely, and this is not just something of recent time. The internet is the absolute, and I hate to say this, is the worst way to shop for a job. You can go out there and see what's available, but you better take another approach if you're trying to get in the door.
And the other thing is, it can be terribly humiliating.
Yeah.
Because you may be a seasoned professional, 20, 30 years of experience, and you're not even getting a response to the things that you're sending. And that's why the sponsor is so important.
And I talk about that a lot, especially I'm involved with a number of women's organizations that sponsorship is something that they do consistently. And I talk to women specifically about how do you find a sponsor. And I think one of the things that I hope you touch upon is the attitude with which you enter into trying to find someone to take on that role.
Well, I identify a framework and a strategy for identifying mentors and sponsors in the book. But one of the things is that you have to be willing to be open to suggestions and being flexible. And I say that especially for some of your older viewers, because there's a tendency sometimes to think, well, I know it all.
Right.
I've got a 20-year-old kid who's going to be my boss telling me what I should do, when I should do it, how long I should do it. This doesn't work for me. And my question is, will that perspective help make your life better? Simple question. And usually the answer is going to be no. And so the challenge now is, we're talking about empowerment. What can I do to help make my life better? I may have to adjust my thinking about how I view myself in the marketplace. Okay. The other thing is, for a lot of people, they continue to be stressed out about money and bills, but they're spending as if the money is going to continue to come. If you feel like a layoff is imminent, then you don't need to create new debt.
Right.
And so my recommendation is, when you go in the store and you leave the store with an item, you should own the item. If you don't own the item once you left the store, you should be able to pay for that item within the next 30 days. And so that way you're not creating new debt. But the problem, Bonnie, is that so many people are acting as if, well, you know what, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. Harsh truth. You may have to trade in that 7 Series BMW.
Right.
And buy a Honda Civic.
Right. Right.
And when you're looking at someone like Patricia, she's not there yet.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up. I'm laughing because I remember when I made the decision to opt out of being in the workplace because of my wanting to be home with my children, my daughter specifically. And I remember I'm telling you, the kids call it bawling. I was bawling because I was a corporate executive. I mean, I could walk in a store and buy anything I wanted, rode around.
It feels good, doesn't it?
It does. Rode around in a, very expensive car, had a car phone when, the cell phones and stuff were not so prevalent. And when I made that decision, the first thing popped into my head was, how am I going to make this work? I can't do that anymore. And I traded in I'll never forget, a beautiful navy blue Acura Legend. And it had every bell and whistle.
That was a car to have back then.
And I had to give that car up. And the only car that I could afford without going into debt, I wanted to pay for it with cash, was this beat up Volvo that, by the time I got rid of the car, I had to take a coat hanger and wire it so that the door would stay closed. I mean, that's how bad it was. But it was it was a decision I made because I wanted to go in a different direction, and there was a sacrifice that I was willing to make. And my car didn't define me. I got to ride around in it, but I wasn't defined by my things.
Unfortunately, the car does define a lot of people, and the other piece of it is, for people who have to make the tough decision to trade down, as you just described, they look at that as an indictment of them.
Right.
And what I'm here to say is that it's not an indictment of the individual, it's an indictment of an economic landscape that is completely destabilized.
If you can hold that thought just for a second, I want to continue with that, but we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to be right back with more Metro Magazine and Dr. Rob.
When you throw away money on wasted electricity, you're throwing away everything you could have bought with it. Saving energy saves you money.
Queen Bee is a book about some of the habits, some of the things that we women do really to undermine ourselves and undermine other women. And it's something that we really can't afford to do any longer. It's actually a book that is a combination of research that I've done interviewing other women and men about what is it that has kept us over the years from becoming the empowered women that we say we are. I'm hoping, if nothing more, that by reading Queen Bee, women will start to really look at themselves for the amazing people that they are. To look at the gifts that each of us brings to the table. And we all have something unique, something special. I also hope women will finally own the fact that you came here to do something special that no one else can do. And not to compare yourself to someone else. You measuring and comparing are totally two different things, but really to begin to embrace the unique qualities and the strengths that you have, because when we bring all of those qualities together collectively, there isn't anything that women cannot do. If you're tuning in late this morning, we're talking to Dr. Rob, who has a brand new book entitled Economic Stress. And when we went to break, you were talking about some of the things people can do when they see that storm coming down the road. And you were talking about downsizing specifically.
Yes, if you think that a layoff is inevitable, one of the things that you may want to do is obviously talk to your mortgage company and also talk to your landlord if you happen to be a renter. One of the other tips I have in the book is you can purchase what is called renter's insurance, and what that will do is it will give you access to funds for, say, up to 2 months to help you in the event that you suffer a layoff.
And a lot of people don't know about that.
It's obscure to most people. I mean, people know about apartment renter's insurance. But renter's insurance is something else. And it's fairly inexpensive. I think it runs maybe about $100 a year. But it can make the difference between you being able to pay the rent and potentially being evicted. So it's certainly something that you could look at. The other thing, especially with credit card companies, and we're coming off the holiday season, so a lot of people have gotten that January bill. As I said earlier, it's important not to create new debt, but the other thing is to build a relationship with your credit card company. If it's possible, speak to the same person every time if you can, by getting their extension or their specific telephone number, because what you want to do is stay in front of the delinquency process, because once the credit card companies begin to come after you, then sometimes your choices can become significantly limited. And so it's all about full disclosures. My job has affected my ability to pay, or rather not having a job has affected my ability to pay. Are there any types of payment arrangements? And it's the same type of thing for utility companies. Most people have an internet provider, which is very important because that's your connection to the outside world in terms of looking for work. So you want to make arrangements to the extent that you can, so that it still allows you to have the service while allowing you to pay a smaller bill each month until
Now-
you get back on your feet.
Now, if you're, say, I use it as an example, say a person or a family has, I don't know, expenses where they're spending $8,000, $9,000 a month, and they can afford it, and they see the storm is coming. Do you think there needs to be a conversation where they assess whether or not they need to stay in this big house or this expensive apartment and maybe downsize or, change the address?
That conversation should happen immediately.
Okay.
It really should. And the other piece of it is when looking at some of the upper middle class and affluent families, they sometimes can be the hardest to influence in terms of changing their minds. Because again, when you're talking about an outlay of $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a month, that's a lot of money. And so a lot of that may not be on necessities, but it could be on the perks. The going out, going to dinners and taking vacations and doing the shopping and those types of things. And you have to ask yourself, okay, what are our necessities, the things that we have to have, and then what are the things that we can scale back on or maybe even eliminate. And so the idea is you want to think smarter about your financial picture, especially if the financial stability has become undone to some extent.
Now, if you're in a situation, and we'll go back to Patricia for a moment, and she knows that her job is going away and the industry is also on the decline, are there any tips you can give our viewers in terms of assessments that might be out there that they can take to see where they might be able to segue into another industry or a different field?
Sure. One of the certifications that is really hot right now and will be for the foreseeable future is what is called the Project Management Professional Certification, or the PMP. A lot of professionals, younger, mid-career and older, are getting retooled to get that, to earn that certification.
Talk about what that can do for you and what fields or industries would that certification be prevalent?
Well, it's certainly prevalent in the IT industry. It's certainly prevalent in the federal government space. It's certainly prevalent in private sector types of organizations, because what it does is shows the employer that you have a certification that is transferable across a number of different disciplines. And so, as I said before, you want to make yourself as relevant as you possibly can in this 21st century. The other thing is, typically, the starting salaries for people with PMPs is low six figures. And so obviously that can go up. But what it does is it gives you a certification that you can use in many different industries. And so if you look at Patricia's background, she's an attorney by training. The industry that she is in has been in decline for several years, and that's something that typically baby boomers face more than younger workers. And so looking at some of those certifications or licensure that are relevant, that are marketable, and that are transferable. And so my number one recommendation would be the PMP.
Okay. What would be your second, say, for someone who's not in the professional arena where they're attorneys or what have you? If you're just, a person who's maybe a factory worker, and what would your recommendation be for them?
And I've enumerated about 20 different positions that, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, will be in high demand to 2020. Several of them include the healthcare industry, home health aides, nurses, people who are providing care to seniors. And think about it, just from a demographic perspective, we have a higher number of older people. And so when you have increases in older persons, that means there's going to be an increase in the need for health care. And so pretty much any of the professions in the health and helping services are going to be in demand.
And it's interesting. I look in the area that we live in, and I look at the amount of commercial building that's going on. I would say drugstores by far are probably one of the fastest growing single commercial businesses that are being erected, and that says a lot about availability of jobs. And if you're talking about someone who may be looking for an industry or something to become trained in, pharmacy technicians, because they're not using, they have a person who is a pharmacist by trade, but they have, in terms of people working underneath them, pharmacy technicians are very, very much in need.
And again, that's the healthcare industry. And so when you look at the extent to which the chronicity of disease increases to a great extent for older people, just because of the life cycle and some of the things that happen, we know that there's going to be a greater need for those helping professions to bring those skill sets to bear. And this is where people who may have been displaced from the workforce, who are interested in helping people, can really get in the door for what could be a second career. The other thing is, and I advocate this in the book, this whole idea of entrepreneurship. And we know that entrepreneurship is not for everyone.
Right.
But as a viable alternative, this may be the moment that you've been waiting for.
What is some of the qualities, because we're both entrepreneurs, and it's not for everybody for sure. What are some of the qualities a person needs to have in order to be a successful entrepreneur?
I think you have to have the presence of mind to listen to your own music to an extent. And what I mean by that is sometimes when you have these grand ideas and visions that you'd like to bring to fruition, people around you, some of the closest people in your life will say, well, why can't you just be satisfied with a regular job?
Right.
Why do you need to go off and try to do something that's probably not going to work?
Right.
And this can be a dream stealer sometimes. And so you have to know in your heart that, if you feel like you've got the capacity to do this, then you need to follow through on it. You need to do the due diligence to see, well, what other people are out there doing this type of thing or something that is similar to it. The other piece is that you have to have a willingness to persevere. Because I think sometimes people have this notion that I'm going to go into business for myself, it's going to be wonderful. And we know what happens to the overwhelming majority of new startups. They don't succeed. The other thing is, if you have developed an idea that can be turned into a business, to what extent is that business marketable?
Right.
What is the niche area that you are trying to create in an environment that has a need for your service? And if in fact you have found that, is that idea, is it something that can be monetized?
Yeah. And you know what? On that note, we're going to have to end this conversation.
So soon, I'm having such a good time.
Same here, but you know what? If you are out there watching this interview this morning, this is a perfect opportunity for you to continue the conversation by, first of all, picking up this book. And also, I'm going to have you talk to the camera to tell people how they can get in touch with you and continue this discussion.
Sure. You can reach me at Dr. Rob, that's DRROB, at economicstresshelp.com. You can also reach me on Twitter @_Dr. Rob. The book is available on Amazon, and I hope that you enjoy and are empowered by what it has to offer.
That was excellent. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's been a pleasure.
And we're out of time, and I'm going to see you on the flip side. But before I go, if you are watching this and you're someone who has an interesting story that you'd like to share, something that can uplift and help to advance our viewers, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at Bonnie Metro Mag, and I will see you next time. Have a wonderful week.